Welcome to Chapter 3 of American Government and Politics. In Chapter 1, we built a vocabulary of political concepts. In Chapter 2, we saw how those concepts take a specifically American shape in American political culture. Now, in Chapter 3, we widen the lens and bring in something that politics cannot be separated from: economics. Why? Because politics is about who gets what, and economics is about how a society produces and distributes what there is to get. So, in this lecture, we'll set out why politics and economics belong to a single field of inquiry, and we'll meet some of the key measurements: GDP, per capita income, the Gini coefficient that political scientists use to compare countries. Let's start with the deep reason. Human beings are a social species. Each of us defines our own needs and desires in cooperation with others. So, societies have to find a way to organize those relations collectively. If we lived in a world of infinite resources, none of this would be necessary. Everyone could simply take whatever they wanted and no one would object, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world of scarcity. Human and non-human resources alike are finite. Society can only produce a limited amount of goods. There are never enough resources to produce all the goods that everyone desires. And so a society has to find a way to distribute the limited goods and services at its disposal. That is the fundamental role of economics: deciding who gets what material resources and how they get them. In democratic systems, the re-election of governments is tied very directly to economic performance. Any administration prefers to hold elections during periods of economic expansion and rising income. Economic growth and stability are among the most powerful factors shaping voter preferences for political parties. And voters hold governments accountable for economic performance because governments exercise both direct and indirect influence over the economy through monetary policy, fiscal policy, and economic regulation. Political decisions shape economic outcomes. Economic outcomes shape political fortunes. It runs in both directions all the time. Now, what is an economy? An economy is the sum of all exchanges, all the ongoing buying and selling within a given area. Every modern economy is built around goods, services, and money, but economies differ radically from one another in their structure. They differ in how wealthy their citizens are, and how that wealth is distributed, and in the technology by which the wealth is produced. And those structural differences profoundly shape political decision making, voter expectations, and even the very stability of political regimes. Political scientists rely on several economic indicators to compare countries. The first and most familiar is gross domestic product, GDP. GDP is an estimate of the total value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders over a given period, typically 1 year. As of 2024, the GDP of the United States is approximately $28 trillion. The United Kingdom is around 3.3 trillion. India is approximately 3.9 trillion. Those are big numbers, and they've grown substantially since earlier editions of this textbook. But GDP alone tells an incomplete story because it doesn't account for population size. It's more meaningful politically to look at GDP per capita, gross domestic product divided by the number of people in the country. Annual per capita income in the United States is approximately $80,000. In the United Kingdom, around $47,000. In India, around $2,700. Those differences have profound implications for what citizens expect from their governments and for the feasibility of different welfare state models. A country with $80,000 per person has options that a country with $2,700 per person simply does not. A third key indicator is the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality within a population. A Gini coefficient of 0 represents perfect equality. Everyone has the same income. A Gini coefficient of 1 represents maximum inequality. One person holds all the income. Countries with more comprehensive social welfare systems consistently record lower Gini coefficients. As of 2024, the US Gini coefficient stood at approximately 0.49. Compare that to 0.28 for Denmark or 0.32 for Germany. The United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients among advanced industrialized democracies. And these differences are not natural facts. They reflect the political choices embedded in each country's tax system and transfer system. There is a direct and reciprocal relationship between the institutional framework in which political decisions are made and the framework in which economic decisions are made. We cannot analyze political values in isolation from economic models. Individual freedom, for example, can only be meaningfully exercised in a political regime that also protects economic rights. As the monetarist economist Milton Friedman argued, individuals who have no rights over economic resources cannot effectively control their own lives. This is why classical liberals and libertarians have always emphasized the connection between private property and individual liberty. Conversely, critics of unregulated markets argue that concentrated private economic power can itself undermine the freedom of those who lack economic resources, creating a form of private domination that is no less constraining than government coercion. The link between economic structure and political liberty cuts both ways. As political values evolve, so do economic models. The concept of economic and social human rights, which emerged forcefully in the aftermath of World War II, has generated persistent tension with free market economics. Most economic and social rights, the right to healthcare, to education, to housing, to a living income, concern goods and services that markets either do not provide at all or do not provide adequately to all citizens. When these goods are declared political entitlements, direct state intervention in the market becomes necessary. A progressive tax policy, for instance, can only be justified by reference to social objectives that go beyond the outcomes of voluntary exchange. So, the scope and design of the welfare state directly determine the structure of the surrounding market economy. The relationship between political ideals and economic models also bears on the very definition of democracy. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, socialist writers argued that true democracy could only be established in communist societies. They contended that material inequality made genuine democratic rule impossible in capitalist states. Western liberal democracies, they argued, were merely formal democracies, systems where the forms of electoral competition were present, but the substance of genuine political equality was not. This debate has not entirely subsided. Contemporary critics of economic inequality from the political left continue to argue that concentrated wealth distorts democratic representation in ways that formal electoral equality cannot correct. So the link between economic models and political systems contains both descriptive and normative dimensions, and analyzing it remains a central task of political economy. Political economy, in its broadest definition, is the economic study of government and politics. The term has carried competing meanings throughout its history. For Adam Smith, political economy was the study of how best to direct a country's resources to maximize wealth creation and distribution. For Karl Marx, it was an inquiry into how control over the means of production shaped the very course of history. And in the 20th century, political economy fragmented into two broad approaches. The economic approach, also known as public choice theory, which applies the logic of rational self-interest to political behavior itself, and the sociological and institutional approach, which focuses on the larger structures and institutions that shape individual behavior. Contemporary political economy increasingly combines these traditions using formal modeling, statistical analysis, and historical comparative methods to understand how political and economic institutions co-evolve. So we've now established why politics and economics belong together, and we've introduced the key indicators we'll use throughout this chapter. In the next lecture, we'll begin the historical story, starting with mercantilism, then Adam Smith, then Karl Marx, the three foundational thinkers whose arguments still echo through today's policy debates. I'll see you there.